Thanks, Bugger, for a very, very interesting speech. It's something which we can all learn by. You actually mentioned no critic can possibly listen to all the CDs that come their way, and of course you're quite right. It came home to me, really, in last November, because I was invited to participate in a panel discussion organised by the Jazz Department of Trinity College of Music in London. And one of the students asked me, how much live music do you actually get to see? You know, really, I thought, blimey, I really haven't thought about that. So I had to do some calculations. Over the last 10 years or so, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to about 20 or 30 jazz festivals a year in various towns and cities across Europe. Last year I went to 28, the year before 23, so about 25 festivals a year for the last 10, 15 years maybe. So over a 3-day event, that's 21 performances, multiplied out by 25 festivals a year. It means I've seen some 525 performances annually. So over 10 years, I reckon I will have seen about 5,250 concerts. And really that's about the only way to try and get a handle on the music, what's happening. Because, of course, a CD is only a photograph of a moment in time. So too is a performance. But there's so much more with the performance that you begin to understand where an artist is coming from, what they're trying to say. And you're completely immersed in that performance, if you choose to stick with it, for a period of about an hour, perhaps more. So I firmly believe that live music is the essence of jazz. And of course I do get to meet, often informally, a lot of festival producers who are very attuned to the changing jazz scene. And I've also been fortunate to interview a lot of musicians over the last 20 or so years, such as Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Pat Metheny, Ahmed Jamal in America, and European stars like Jan Garbarek, Bolo Stenson, Michael Volney, John Sermon, Thomas Stanko, John Taylor, and of course Bugger, all of whom have, as we've just heard from Bugger, have their own take on the state of jazz today. So when it comes to reading the rooms, which is the title of the talk today, taking a view on the state of jazz today, I'm hoping some of this accumulated background noise might come in useful. Because we all hear contemporaneous jazz, which is to say live performances, against a background of a past provided by recordings. And equally, we hear the past against a background of the present. As our experience of one changes, so mysteriously does our experience of the other. This subconscious mental discourse can produce a profit facing backwards if we allow the security of the past to take precedence over the uncertainties of the present. And it can happen to jazz commentators, it can happen to musicians, record producers, educators, promoters, and fans. Yet the one great history lesson in jazz is that it has always been in a state of becoming. So we're always going to be grappling with a degree of uncertainty that new ideas and new approaches bring. I guess any view on the state of jazz today must start where it all began. And during the new millennium years, there's no shortage of great jazz to be heard in America, from established stars to dedicated young professionals trying to establish themselves in a highly competitive music scene. And despite the claims, the competing claims of popular culture, in 2009, the New York Times argued that young audiences were finding their way into the music, albeit acknowledging that in America, live jazz is hard to come by outside a handful of major cities. Doomsayers may be playing taps, the New York Times said, but jazz isn't ready to sing the blues. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this brief optimistic view of jazz in the US made no mention about the health of jazz in other markets. Yet even in the 1960s, the British saxophonist Joe Harriott, who arrived at a concept of free jazz entirely independently, but at the same time as Ornette Coleman, asserted originality comes from all over the place, not just the USA. And that's never been more true than today. In Europe, for example, jazz tends to be viewed as having transcended its American and African American origins, and, like any of the arts, is regarded as universal. So if we are looking at the one essential difference in how jazz is perceived in Europe and how it's perceived in the United States, we might start here. Let me give you an example. In Europe, jazz is not viewed as the exclusive province of Americans anymore. any more than opera is viewed as the exclusive province of Italians, ballet the exclusive province of Russians, or classical music the exclusive province of Germans. This universalist view of jazz was expressed as long ago as 1940 by the French critic Charles Delaunay, and reprinted in an anthology of jazz writing in 1999. It was prefaced by the editor's introductory remarks that were at odds with Delaunay's view of jazz, since it, quote, supported universalism and opposed American exceptionalism, allowing French critics and fans to participate equally in jazz. So what he's saying is a universalist view of jazz denies American exceptionalism and allows other countries to participate equally in jazz. But we can't have that, can we? Norwegians will be playing jazz next. However, we live in a globalized world, a feature of which is its interconnectedness, not only in areas such as finance, trade, and social mobility, but also in the realm of jazz. And it seems remarkable that a nation that did the most to advance the notion of globalization, of opening markets to allow the free flow of goods, services, finance, and culture across national borders, should remain a little bit protectionist when it comes to jazz. But it's no exaggeration to say the United States has felt the impact of the financial crisis more than any other nation. Rising unemployment and falling house prices have all contributed to a situation where people's net disposable income has dropped, the money they use for life's luxuries like going to a jazz concert. The problem is that the business model of jazz was already on shaky foundations. Even the New York Times asked, how come the business of jazz is so anemic and the business of jazz education so strong? It's a good question. Since the one area in jazz that makes real profits in the USA is jazz education, an industry that's quadrupled over the last 20 years. But even in this buoyant sector of the jazz economy was rocked when the International Association of Jazz Educators unexpectedly filed for bankruptcy a matter of weeks after its 2008 convention. The IAJE was a 40-year-old organization whose annual conventions were a cornerstone of jazz education in the USA. So news of its unexpected demise caused the kind of reverberations in the world of American jazz that the failure of Lehman Brothers would cause in the financial world just a matter of months later. Many even pondered the future of the music itself, since a year earlier, the New York jazz scene had similarly been rocked by the news that the Tonic, a small club on the east side, had finally closed its doors. Once host to artists like Cecil Taylor and John Zorn, escalating rent in the prime real estate of the city was blamed for its demise, which hit the US national news with footage of jazz musicians protesting at its closure and being led away in handcuffs to waiting police vans. As the Tonic became one more club in the New York City Jazz Club Bible to have RIP added after its name, the steady toll of commercial radio stations cutting their jazz programs mounted. In 2008, a feature in the Wall Street Journal headlined, "Can Jazz Be Saved?" And it concluded it's no longer possible for head-in-the-sand types to pretend that the great American art form is economically healthy, or the future looks anything other than bleak. And I asked saxophonist, arranger, composer, and Grammy winner Bob Belden, the leader of critically acclaimed group Animation, for his take on things. Bob graduated from the jazz program at the North State Texas University in the 1970s before moving to New York, and has been watching the ebb and flow of jazz in the Big Apple ever since. But he says he's never known things quite as bad as they are at the moment. Looking at the scene, he says, all of a sudden there are too few professional choices for musicians, and there are way too many musicians working for door money. And this is a problem which is gradually creeping into jazz, not only in America, but in Europe as well. But in America particularly, the growth of gigs where artists play for a share of admittance money or door money instead of an agreed fee has gone unreported by the media. Even the closure of the Tonic, which was widely covered by the TV and press in the US, made no mention that artists played there for door money. Yet the rise of door money gigs is making it increasingly difficult for musicians to support themselves. As the critically acclaimed composer and arranger Darcy James argued, leader of Secret Society, a big band that performs his original works around New York City, noted on his blog, and I quote, Dwindling freelance opportunities plus disappearing venues have all contributed to a scene where it's not uncommon to see world-class musicians fiercely competing for the privilege of playing past-the-hat gigs. End quote. Perhaps not surprisingly, these world-class musicians are notoriously reluctant to talk about playing for a share of door money for fear of damaging their earning power in the European and Japanese markets. If a promoter in Europe, for example, learns musician X gets around $60 a night for door money, why, the reasoning goes, should he pay $5,000 for a 90-minute set in Europe? Since people don't want to talk about playing for door money, it only serves to conceal the fault lines in American jazz infrastructure, which is unable to support its musicians. The way the business of jazz is structured in the United States is that most established jazz musicians have to rely on markets outside the United States for a significant portion of their income. The most important market is the subsidized circuits here in Europe. This is hardly news. Even back in the 1970s, the legend, no Europe, no jazz. 2 years ago, I interviewed the saxophonist and ECM artist Mark Turner, and his remarks underline the reality of the situation today. He said, quote, "In New York, competition for work is very high. Here it's very difficult to make a living, it's pretty hard. But when you reach a certain level, you're able to find work in Europe. And I would say for me, most of my playing, about 75%, most of my income is from Europe. If I had to earn it in New York, forget it. I work in New York, of course I do. With my band and different bands as a sideman, we all do that, and some great music, yes. But most of my income comes from Europe. Even in Chicago, which has got a very active jazz scene, musicians are mainly playing for door money. Many of you know bassist Ingeborg Hacker-Flatten, a graduate of Trondheim here, who moved to Chicago because of the affinity many jazz musicians feel for the European free jazz in general, and people like Peter Brotzmann and Max Gustafsson in particular. Ingeborg said he discovered the best gigs in Chicago paid about $60, which he said was nothing from a European perspective. So to survive as a jazz musician in America, he was confronted with the reality that faces the leading lights of the Chicago jazz scene, like saxophonist Ken Vandermark or drummer Hamid Drake, who have to journey to Europe to generate an adequate income stream. Ingeborg said, "I lived in Chicago for 18 months. I couldn't survive living there just playing for the door. No, I earned my money in Europe. I was back and forth every second month, a lot of traveling," end quote. As we've seen, falling audience numbers in the US play a part in this, and if we are to believe the figures in the National Endowment for the Arts Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, we find the audience for jazz in America was both shrinking, it's dropped by an incredible 58% since 1982, and was getting older. The median age of jazz audiences was put at a national average of 46. The same is for opera, classical music, and ballet. It means that jazz has come to be viewed as a form of high art, which does not come as a surprise, but in America comes with certain preconceptions. Many musicians play in styles rooted in the post-bop mainstream because that's what the American public seem to be prepared to pay for, rather than edgier or more experimental forms of jazz. While there's no shortage of audiences at the Jazz at Lincoln Center and Dizzy's Club Coca-Cola, or clubs such as the Vanguard, Birdland, Iridium and the Smoke, the chances of playing experimental forms of jazz for anything more than door money have narrowed. This may be as a result of the belief expressed by some in the 1990s that for jazz to be jazz, it must possess a swing and blues sensibility, elements that were present when jazz was an expression of urban black engagement with modern life, and articulated the experience of collective identity based on implicit notions of musical roots, authenticity, and community. This reading of jazz placed its core values in its golden years, ambiguously located between the birth of jazz and the mid-1960s. Thus, in claiming jazz as an exclusively African-American form, it became a means of asserting both cultural identity and of placing a specifically African-American art form at the center of American cultural life. These were highly laudable ambitions, but in attempting to create a set of cognitive principles to define jazz's master narrative and unite the jazz community around these principles has its idiomatic strengths and weaknesses. Ultimately, it was the weaknesses of these arguments that had the effect of undoing these rationalizations after the fact. The very act of drawing inspiration and identity from a sense of connectedness with jazz's golden years had the effect of narrowcasting the music and setting in a train a perception among American people that jazz was more about the past than the future. It has taken time, but a predictable reaction to the effects of the swing and blues mantra is now underway. Last year, the critically acclaimed trumpeter Nicholas Payton blogged on his website that, quote, "the very fact that so many people are holding on to this idea of what jazz is supposed to be is exactly what makes it not cool. People are holding on to an idea that died long ago." Continuing this theme, he wrote, "Jazz is a marketing ploy that serves an elite few." I think we know who he's talking about there. "The elite make all the money whilst they tell the true artists it's cool to be broke." And he concluded, "I'm Nicholas Payton, and I don't play the J word, I play BAM." Prompted by Payton's post, the inaugural BAM Black American Music Conference was held in New York's Birdland Jazz Club in January this year, where Payton reaffirmed, with others, that they no longer play jazz but BAM. Among the panelists was pianist and recipient of a Pew Fellowship for the Arts, Orrin Evans, who told a Philly blog, quote, "It's the image, not the music. The name is limiting audiences," end quote. The panel theorized the J word was not only an impediment to employment, but went further by concluding the J word now had racist connotations, prompting the Philly blog to headline, "The word jazz will now be racist." These artists appear to be claiming that in the hurly-burly of modern life, jazz has little meaning in American people's daily lives. In an attempt to bring jazz back into the mainstream of American life, pianist Robert Glasper, like Nicholas Payton and the BAM artists, have also broken ranks with the true believers in the swing and blues mantra. Glasper with his album Black Radio, steeped in R&B, funk, rap, electronic sounds, and several guest artists, including rappers and Erykah Badu. In a telling remark to the LA Times, Glasper said, quote, "This is what jazz sounds like now. If it would have kept evolving and everybody was okay with it evolving, this is where it would be. If jazz has been stagnant for too long, at least in hip-hop, stuff always happens. Jazz, nothing happens. It's literally like being at an old folks' home on bingo night." End quote. Glasper's got quite interesting ideas about what jazz is or isn't. In the recent film documentary, Icons Amongst Us, he said, quote, "There's a whole movement of cats from Europe that play jazz, but there's a key thing missing in most of it when I hear it. Not putting Europe down or anything, but they're classically based, so it's a classically trained thing. And jazz isn't based on classical music, it's based on blues and church and emotion and spirit. The real shit. So you can play all the shit you want, but if you've none of that, ... End quote. Glasper's view has to do with who we are and where we are in the world, since this has the capacity to influence the meanings we construe from art. We all apply an unconscious reading to any given thing as a result of the culture in which we are raised, be it food, relationships, consumer goods, art, music, and so on. All cultures are different, and what most people don't realize is that these differences actually lead to us processing the same information in different ways. For Glasper, European jazz means one thing, while for many Europeans, jazz from Europe means something else, perhaps resonating in a way that appeals to European people. Heaven forbid. For one thing, European musicians are not burdened by the weight of the jazz tradition and find the paths to follow that are quite different to those being trodden in the USA. Norwegian jazz, for example, has found a significant audience in Europe. Today, no overview of what's happening in jazz can ignore Norwegian or indeed Scandinavian jazz as one of the most significant developments in globalization or localization of jazz as a global phenomenon. Maybe it took the artistic breakthrough of Norwegian jazz to bring a greater awareness in Europe of homegrown product. Such was the dominance of American jazz in magazines, features, recordings at festivals and at jazz clubs, when people like Bugger, the late Esbjørn Svensson, Nils Petter Molver, Jan Garbarek and more began headlining at European jazz festivals. I think it caused many European promoters to wake up to their own local talent. And taking a leaf out of Norway's book, some countries and regions began actively promoting their own talent through their respective government-funded national jazz organizations. The Catalonian Jazz Organization is one example of a small area of Europe going out into the marketplace and aggressively promoting its jazz musicians. They're not alone. Hungary now regularly presents an annual showcase of its jazz talent. The Flemish jazz scene in Belgium is another that benefits from government money to promote its activities. While in contrast, the scene in Holland, which every other year had enough funds to fly in half a dozen American journalists to report on its showcase, had its funding cut drastically. Certainly government cutbacks will eventually impact on jazz here in Europe, but broadly speaking, a combination of a strong infrastructure and good audience numbers is actually seeing increased support from the private sector. However, for me, the most significant development in recent times is the awakening of the sleeping giant of European jazz, Germany. Jazz in Germany is closely connected with public radio, which provides the main supporting pillar for the German jazz scene. German National Public Radio has two tiers, national and regional. Germany's federal states are mirrored by a system where more or less every region has its own public radio station, and every public radio station has its own jazz producer. As such, it's part of their cultural policy to document the regional jazz scene through concerts, studio broadcasts, and playing CDs of local musicians. Some radio stations, WDR and SWR, acknowledge the regional scene with jazz awards. 3 stations have their own big bands, permanent orchestras that are exclusively dedicated to jazz. NDR in Hamburg, HR in Frankfurt, and WDR in Cologne, which all have international reputations. On top of the regional structure of radio is the national radio station Deutschlandfunk, DLF, which has presented Jugendjazz since 1997, a nationwide youth competition that offers the winning band studio recording at DLF, which has played an important role in identifying and promoting young talent in Germany. Today, Germany may be home to more than 130 classical orchestras, more than any other country in the world, but for over 50 years it's embraced jazz, with universities at Graz and Gießen fighting it out for the honour of having the first ever degree courses in Europe. It would be perhaps something of a surprise if the same degree of academic rigour that classical students undergo was not applied to aspiring jazz musicians. With 18 universities in Germany offering degree courses in jazz disciplines, the country has for some while been producing young musicians of a remarkably high standard. In recent times, many critics, promoters and fans in Europe have been talking about the growing confidence of the German jazz scene. Currently, the Berlin jazz scene has been gathering a reputation as one of the European hotspots for creative jazz. Although it must be said, many gigs here are for door money, which are supported by the public radio station WDR that offers support for artists with sensible fees for radio work commissions and even festival support. Currently, pianist Michael Volny is the main standard bearer of young German jazz. And behind him are several young musicians reaching the same high standards being attained here in Norway. Add to this the very best talent now emerging from across Europe, and the future should look bright. My only criticism is the lack of awareness across Europe of each country's jazz talent. Spain has no idea what is happening in Finland. Finland has no idea what's happening in Belgium. Belgium has no idea what's happening in Italy. Italy has no idea what's happening in the UK, and the UK has no idea what's happening in Europe. Nor does France. In the States, you can go to New York City to get noticed. In Europe, you have to hope for the best. Perhaps this will change with the European showcases such as Jazz Ahead and 12 Points. Let's hope so. Thank you for listening.